Welcome, dear listener. Dare you step deeper into the darkness with me? Each whispered tale will linger, a cold fingerprint on your mind. Long after this night ends, they were chosen to keep you awake, trembling. I'm delighted you've chosen to spend your evening within these shadows. Let us begin. Story 1. After sprinkling parmesan over the mouth-watering chicken and spinach tortellini I just made, I scraped half the dish into the sink and turned on the garbage disposal with an irritated sigh. I hated having to throw half of it away each time the only reason I moved into this apartment was because rent was cheaper after I'd lost my job and nearly burned through my meager savings. It definitely wasn't the suffocating ambience and sketchy neighborhood, and it most definitely wasn't the meal prep boxes left daily at my door. I only learned about those when the previous tenant visited me, Lida, dropped by the very same day I moved in, after pointing out the leaky corners I should avoid, suggesting affordable roach traps, and teaching me how to lock the window with a broomstick. She mentioned the boxes. I thought she was kidding, but she was dead serious. I had to prepare dinner each day, dump half in the garbage disposal, and eat the rest right away. She seemed so nonchalant about it, but I wasn't. Who was sending them? Why? What would happen if I refused? She had no solid answers. All she knew was what the previous tenant had told her, which is what they were told by the previous tenant, and so on. Origins unknown. Even the landlord had no idea this was going on. And Lida stressed that I must never tell him. She also stressed that I must never refuse. Why? She said protection, claiming that for as long as she'd lived here, this apartment was never robbed. Was she seriously insinuating that this beep requirement protected her? She shrugged and said anything was possible. She didn't question the absurdity of it all. But she did question my reluctance. She assured me that she'd eaten from the boxes every day for the year she'd lived here, and they were legit. No prank, no poison, no strings attached. Just dump half in the garbage disposal and eat the rest right away. She began listing the various meals she'd prepared, and my empty stomach growled. I hadn't had a decent meal in days, and it didn't take me long before I caved now. After a month of delicious food, my unease had ebbed, but not my disdain. After I turned off the garbage disposal, I grabbed the remaining chicken and spinach tortellini and plopped down on the floor, eating my only meal today. Despite licking the plate clean, my stomach still complained, and I glared at the sink. Half a portion wasn't enough, and I was sick of wasting part of a perfectly good meal, one that I'd worked beep, no less. I was done following these ridiculous rules. Tomorrow, I was going to eat the entire thing, and I did for the next week. I prepared and ate the whole meal, and nothing happened. I'll admit, I was nervous the first few days, but when the world didn't collapse and the boxes kept coming, I felt pretty clever for being the first to break this ridiculous and wasteful trend. As long as food kept getting delivered right to my door, I was going to eat it. All of it 8 days later, I realized my actions could be killed me. My bladder woke me up that night, and I shambled to the bathroom. After washing my hands, I made my way back to my sleeping bag, and I frowned at an unusual draft before I could figure out where it was coming from. A startling force knocked me to the ground. My heart leapt to my throat, and it probably would be jumped out of my mouth if there wasn't a hand smothering my scream. The stench of sweat filled my lungs as I struggled beneath a bony weight. My panicked thoughts flashing horrifying scenarios through my mind. A sharp hiss for silence pierced my ear as the cold metal of a gun pressed against my temple, and I abided, trembling face down on the floor. I held my breath, my eyes wide in fearful anticipation, as I heard my attacker grunting and rummaging. I turned my gaze to the open window, and I cursed myself for not propping the broomstick properly, as I saw it lying on the floor in no time. The intruder had shoved a filthy rag in my mouth and yanked my arms behind my back, binding them before he lashed my ankles together. Only then did he take his weight off me and flip me over, his sunken eyes wild under a mess of hair. He was definitely on something, and it was frightening. His actions had no hesitation. He came here for something, and he wasn't leaving without it. The question was, what? That mystery didn't last long, as he demanded to know where I hid my valuables. I stared at him in disbelief. Did he not see the squalor I was living in? I didn't even have furniture. Did he think I had cash stuffed in my frayed sleeping bag, gold hidden in the rusty oven, diamonds stashed behind the broken radiator? My baffled silence wasn't the answer he was looking for, and I cried out as he punched me in the face. He lifted his fist again, and I flinched, whimpering through my gag as I nodded towards my meager possessions. My wallet and my phone. He crawled over to them, and I crawled away, tears stinging my eyes as my cheek throbbed to the rhythm of my stuttering heart. I was certain $11.25 and a phone with a cracked screen wouldn't be enough to appease him. He seemed desperate enough to beep. I had to save myself before it was too late, as he tore through my wallet in frustration. I made my way to the kitchen my eyes on the drawers. I just needed a knife to cut through these bonds, and I could make a run for it, balancing on my knees. I bent over and reached up with my hands, my trembling fingers searching for the handle. Gripping it, I pulled, but it didn't move. This was the worst time for it to stick. I wiggled it, as I always do, but my position was less than optimal, and the drawer refused to budge after a particularly forceful yank. I lost my balance and fell with a grunt, and my terrified eyes turned towards the door as the intruder stomped in, gun aimed at me. I screamed and cowered against the cupboards, my heart slamming against my rib cage as the blood drained from my face end. Then the blood drained from his face eye, followed his petrified gaze, and I screamed even louder as an unholy creature erupted from the sinket, towered over us like a giant furry centipede, pointy legs bristling from its long Inkai body, and spikes jutting out of its mouth with a lurching motion, looking almost as though it was falling. It descended upon the intruder, silencing his scream with a stab straight through his throat. It didn't silence my screams, though, and I continued to shriek through my gag as the monster continued to stab the man, its sharp legs jabbing at him like a macabre typewriter. It was facing away, but that didn't stop the spraying blood from dotting every surface of the kitchen, including me after a few final jabs. The monster stopped puncturing the intruder, and I watched in horror as it began sliding the mutilated body into its mouth, its legs tapping against the cracked tiles with excitement, as though this was its first meal in ages. It devoured its beep the way a snake would, completely whole, and beep fought my screams as it burned my throat once the last of the man disappeared. The creature gulped a few times and began spasming. For a hopeful moment, I thought it was choking and dying, but to my terrified dismay, I realized it was crushing the body within its own as I heard bones snap and Grinded's convulsing stopped, and shock stole my screams as I watched its sharp legs retract into its blood-soaked fur. It now looked more like a giant fluffy caterpillar than a centipede, and my raspy breaths raced my pulse as I fearfully waited to see what it would do next. I stared in fraught disbelief as the monster began slithering across the floor, lapping up every drop of blood it came across before it stretched itself to reach the counters, walls, and ceiling. It was a lot more coordinated after eating, and that amplified my unease. Soon, only my corner was left, and it turned to me, giving me my first clear view of its face. It wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined pincers, antennas, and compound eyes, but instead I saw a rounded snout, floppy ears, and deep scars where its eyes should be. In any other scenario, it might pass for cute, But right now, all it did was reboot my vocal cords. As it slithered closer, my muffled screams echoed. As I pressed myself against the cupboards, petrified. But it didn't seem to care as it licked up the blood around me. When it began licking me, my heart almost stopped beating right then. And there, as I was certain I was next on the menu, and then it nuzzled me. I peeked through my eyelids, gulping, and I frowned in uneasy confusion as it curled up beside me, laying its large head on my lap. Slowly, I allowed my screams to stop, my tense body quivering with adrenaline. It had murdered my attacker, cleaned up the crime scene, and now was snuggling. A knock on the door startled us as my neighbors asked if I was all right, and I gasped, afraid the monster would go after them. To my surprise, it shrank away instead, slithering towards the sink and stretching itself thin before wiggling down the drain. The door crashed open, and my neighbors ran in, the look on their faces matching mine as they saw me bound in the corner, quaking with shock. After they freed me and I found my voice, I mentioned the robber, but I gave him a happier ending as I claimed he ran away. As much as the creature terrified me, it saved my life, and I didn't want to get it in trouble. Besides, who'd believe me? Maybe Lida would. I decided to call her in the morning, but that left me up all night, thinking, was that creature the thing we'd been feeding all this time? Was Lida right? Was it here to protect us? Was it too weak to scare off the robber before he attacked me? Because I unintentionally starved it for over a week, and despite all that, did it care for me that much that it didn't eat me, saved my life, and snuggled? I hoped that was the case. The creature didn't seem malevolent towards me, but there were still many unanswered questions and uncertainties, and I hoped Lida could answer them. She couldn't. I didn't mention the monster right away, afraid she'd be clueless and think I was insane. Instead, I asked if she knew what was protecting us, and if anything unusual slithered out of the kitchen sink. She said our daily ritual protected us, a modern version of ancient sacrifices to the gods. And then she suggested I ask the landlord to fix my pest issues. I still had no answers, too poor to leave the apartment, and not willing to tempt fate. I decided to continue dumping half the meal in the garbage disposal. If that creature was going to protect me, I had to stay on its good side the next day. I carried the box to the kitchen, pinned the recipe to my fridge, and began preparing a spicy salmon pizza, keeping a wary eye on the sink as I turned to the recipe, running my finger down the instructions. It slipped from beneath the magnet and fell to the floor. This happened every once in a while, but this time the glossy paper disappeared beneath the fridge, not willing to stick my hand under there. I grabbed a wire coat hanger, stretched it out, and began fishing. I recovered a medley of cereal crumbs, a fossilized chicken wing, a pen cap, a used car salesman's business card, 2 dead roaches, my recipe, and a strange yellowed paper curious. I dusted it off and read it, my eyes expanding with every word. / beep, December 11. 2013 beep beep, dear tenant. Beep beep, I moved into this apartment to care for my savior. I was a hunter, you see, and I had terminal cancer. I was reckless, and I didn't care when death would choose to take me, beep beep, but Alesta cared. She protected me when I challenged a bear, appearing out of the blue and nearly dying herself. No one had ever done for me what she did, and I was moved by her selflessness, beep beep. Alesta got injured and lost her eyesight. She was no longer able to hunt, and I felt responsible. I invited her to live with me, with the last of my savings. I signed up for 10 years of a meal prep program. I know I won't live that long. She may not either. But I still ask you, dear tenant, to continue honoring her. Beep beep every evening. Prepare the meal and leave it in the cupboard under the sink. Then go to sleep. The next morning, if the plate is still full, do with it as you wish. If the plate is empty, don't be alarmed. Just continue to honor my Savior, and you'll be safe and secure as long as you live here, beep beep, dear tenant. This is all I ask of you, fulfilling a grateful man's dying wish. Please don't mention this to anyone, especially not the landlord. But if you end up moving out, please hand this letter to the new tenant, beep beep. And when the 10 years are up on December 11, 2023, please, my friend, consider renewing. Alesta deserves it, beep beep. Thank you and be blessed. Beep beep, Callum beep, / /. I put the letter down, stunned. The creature truly was a protector. Alesta, brought here to be cared for by a man with little time. Callum put a lot of faith in a bunch of strangers. But I guess he didn't have a choice. He could have at least told us what we were dealing with. But maybe he didn't trust we'd have Alesta's best interest at heart. I was surprised. We'd all followed the rule despite how cryptic it was. Well, at least until I came along. I looked at the letter again. Would I have been more inclined to abide if I'd received this? I'll never know, because one of the previous tenants misplaced it and passed on the message verbally, the request changing from person to person like a game of telephone, until we were feeding Alesta half her intended meal through the garbage disposal. Well, that wasn't going to happen anymore, and I didn't want Alesta to hide anymore either. She saved my life, and I wanted to improve hers after preparing the spicy salmon pizza. I placed it on the kitchen floor and sat cross-legged in front of it, working up the courage. I cleared my throat and called out her name, Alesta. A soft gurgle sounded from the drain. Alesta, dinner. Food. Yummy food. I'd never met a creature like Alesta before, and I had no idea how intelligent she was. Come out. It's okay. You don't have to eat in the drain anymore. You can live out here with me. I held my breath as she poked her head out of the sink, her nose sniffing the air. Hey, Alesta. She gurgled again. She seemed to like hearing her name, the one her only friend had given her. Well, now she had another friend. I gestured to the pizza and smiled before I remembered she couldn't see. This pizza is all for you. I looked down with regret. I am sorry. I didn't feed you last week. I'll never do that again. I couldn't help but tense up as she slithered over, her long, slender body compressing into a bulbous form as she settled in front of me. This was going to take some getting used to. She smelled like rust and old lettuce, and I hoped she wasn't averse to baths. Now that she didn't have to hide any more two pointy legs protruded from her fur, and they poked around blindly until they found the plate. I watched in surprise as she split the pizza and slid half over to me, and I pushed it back. No, it's all for you, like Callum wanted. As I said that, my stomach growled, and Alesta chirped in response and slid half towards me again. She picked up a slice and began nibbling, and I smiled, teary-eyed, as I reached for my own slice. For the first time ever, I was glad I'd lost my job, and once I get a new one, neither of us will ever go hungry again. Drawings of Alesta in both her forms / more SR. Story 2. I was there for 3 years. The station had an auto shop attached, but was rarely needed at night. So I typically just dealt with people coming for gas occasionally. IDB asked to work on a car overnight from the day shift. One time, I found several bags of beep leaking out from the driver's seat. I was nervous the owners would know I saw it, so I stuffed the bags back in. The station was out on a country road, so the types of customers I generally served were truckers or farmers or the random couple driving home from a date. However, there were the anomalies, the car accidents, the beep driver that killed a small family in the intersection. Out front, there was a vicious, blazing inferno coming out of that minivan. The dad made it out, but he was on fire and died in the middle of the road one time. I served gas to someone who was being chased by the police. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. I just thought the driver was in a hurry. I was robbed at gunpoint, twice. It was the same two ski-masked guys, too. They just took turns speaking between the two incidents. Then there was the time an old guy drove up, got out of his car, and died of a heart attack 2 steps later. Those incidents were normal, or at least understandable, explainable. But there was one night something unexplainable happened. It was shortly after 3 a.m. Headlights drove in carrying a 1966 Pontiac Bonneville 2-door coupe. A thin trail of smoke was coming from under the hood. The inside of the windows were all fogged up, so I couldn't really see the interior of the car or the occupants. The car drove past the gas station and right into the auto shop. The lights weren't even on inside the shop, but the headlights lit it up. I went to greet the driver and flipped on the overhead lights of the shop, but they came on weak and dim. The driver's side door opened as I approached, and I was immediately hit with a stench of old, damp cloth and dust. A middle-aged man got out uneasily, like his knees were made of twigs. He wore one of those black Quaker hats, with dark hair spiking from under it, and a graying goatee. The man's face was covered in lines and wrinkles, and his eyes sunk back into his head. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Check the oil. Check the engine. He choked out and walked past me, fumbling out an old box of matches. The passenger door closed, and a middle-aged woman stood there. She had thick, dark hair that looked like it was greased through with gel and matted to her head. An uneven set of bangs cut across her forehead. The woman carried the same sunken-in eyes as the man, but her face was covered in days-old makeup, rosy cheeks, blue eyeliner, red lipstick. Even through the smearing, you could tell it was applied with heavy exaggeration. Then the woman smiled at me. I wish she hadn't. Her teeth were dirty orange and speckled with black dots. Her gums were dark gray. I noticed she only had the front 6 teeth on her upper and lower jaws. She didn't appear to have any molars, which I shouldn't know. But she couldn't stop smiling to reveal that. The moment the woman saw me, her lips had stretched into a wide-mouthed grin that curved downward like a catfish. It was a strange and frightening smile, like it was pulled and stretched over a screaming face. The woman began speaking to me, but she spoke so softly I couldn't hear her. I kept leaning forward, trying to get a better ear, but the closer I got, the further her voice sounded. Then I realized we were inches from each other's faces. Her breath was rancid as she spoke, and I finally heard what she was saying. Don T, go in the car. The woman pulled back, and I saw the scream behind the smile in her eyes. She was terrified. Joan, the driver, was already outside the auto shop, lighting up a dirty, looking home-rolled cigarette. The woman, Joan, followed him. She looked back, continuing to smile, but her eyes told a story of desperation and horror. They gave me chills, and I was happy the two were going to wait outside. I watched the strange couple walk down to the edge of the gas station, where it made up the corner of a quiet country intersection. I turned to the car, not really sure what to do, after I couldn't get under the hood. I figured there was a release latch under the steering wheel. I went to the driver's side door and saw the window was down. I leaned in through the window and searched and fumbled until I found the latch. I flicked it open and saw the hood pop up. As I was pulling myself out, a thought struck me. The window was up when the man drove in. It was up when he walked off. How did it get down? Then my eyes caught the rearview mirror, and what was in the backseat there was a little boy staring at me. He sat calmly in the middle seat with his seatbelt still on. He had a strange, swirling beep scar that reminded me of a boy I went to grade school with named Johnny Watkins. He'd been attacked by a dog when he was little, and large portions of his face were horrendously scarred. That is what this boy looked like, and he had something that looked like mud and dirt smeared around his mouth and chin. The same smears were on his hands and wrists. The boy wore old, dirty overalls and a flannel shirt underneath. His eyes were locked on me. They carried an accusatory glare, like he was catching me stealing. I quickly blurted out, "Hey, buddy, just checking out the engine. Then we'll get you and your parents on their way." The boy stared back, his brow furrowed down at the center, angrily. "They were not my parents," he croaked out. Then he started to make a strange sound. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but then it became clear. The boy was laughing in his own odd way. It was like his breath was hitching up repeatedly during the inhale. I didn't know what to do or say, so I pulled myself out of the window and made my way to the hood. I looked out and saw Joan and the man were still at the corner, smoking and arguing. I popped the hood up and was greeted with a cloud of smoke. I figured it was a motor oil spill or leak at first. Then I stared down at the engine, and I had no idea what to make of it. It looked foreign, but also homemade. It was all connected and had metal plates fastened around it, protecting parts of the wiring and cables, so it was next to impossible to see what was wrong. I honestly didn't know what the beep eye was looking at, but I managed to find what looked like a small handle for a dipstick, and I twisted and pulled it out. It beep was beep for the oil. I cleaned it, put it back in, and pulled it to inspect. Basically dry. The little oil at the end felt gritty. It needed a change. The car was parked over our lift, so I didn't have to get in to move it. But I couldn't leave the kid in there. He had to get out. Safety precautions and all. I went to the driver's side window, but the window was up again. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I went over to the passenger side and found it locked too. I peered in through the dirty windows to try to signal to the boy to open the door, but the back seat was empty. The car was empty. He was gone. The only explanation I could come up with was that the back seats of the car pulled down and allowed access to the trunk. So I checked the trunk, but it was also locked. I knocked on it, trying to get the boy's attention if he was inside, but nothing came back. I looked outside, but couldn't see Joan or the man. I was confused and nervous, and all I could think to do was explain that our lift wasn't working, so they need to get their oil changed at another shop in the next few days. Then I'd send them on their way. A loud clunk made me jump. On the other side of the garage, a loose wrench was on the ground. I walked over to it and picked it up. It had a small, child-sized, muddy handprint on it, and suddenly that odd laugh echoed out from somewhere in the garage. I raised the wrench to swing, but there was nothing to swing at. The loud metal rattling of the front, retracting doors slamming shut, made me yell. I went over to inspect the now shut door, but as I did, the retracting metal doors at the back slammed shut as well. At this point, I figured the kid was messing with me, so I called out to him, telling him playtime was over and to come on out. Then the power went out. The garage was completely black. Not a single window could be seen. I tried to open the front metal gate, but it wouldn't budge, like it was welded shut. More metal tools clanged against the ground. One slammed against the metal door, right beside my head, and another. The boy's hitched laughter croaked out from somewhere in the dark of the shop. I couldn't see anything, but knew the layout of the garage, inside out and backwards. There was a flashlight on the far end of the wall to my right. There were shelves along the wall, and a wide workbench I could follow. I moved along the metal door to the wall and found the edge of the bench. The boy's laughter got louder, echoing through the garage. It stopped sounding human, though. It was more hyena-like, and the source of the laughter was getting closer to me. With it, I felt a hot, rotten breath assaulting my nostrils. It followed me along the bench and towards the end of the wall. Through laughing, the boy quietly repeated, "I am gonna find ya. I am gonna find ya." My foot hit what felt like a ratchet wrench, which loudly skittered across the metal, grating on the floor. "Was that you?" the boy squealed out, realizing I still had the wrench in my hands I first picked up. I threw it across the garage, hoping to hit the back wall and cause a distraction. It left my hand, but it never landed. "There you are," the voice called out through laughs. Something shuffled behind me. I hit the end of the bench and reached up, knocking over multiple tools and causing a series of loud crashes. But I didn't care. I felt the flashlight grip and turned it on, spinning and pointing the light behind me. I wished I hadn't. The boy was 2 feet from me. I only saw his face for a moment, but that was enough. The boy's beep scar had unraveled, like layers of extra skin in some strange face scarf covering. Only the fleshy layers were actually attached to him and contained rows of needle-like teeth on the inside. When the skin flap opened, it tripled the original diameter of his mouth. I screamed and fell backward. I expected to hit the ground and immediately have the boy's frightening mouth biting down on my face, or neck high hit the pavement outside the garage instead. The lights of the gas station poured over me. I looked back into the garage from my back. The lights were on. The metal door was open. The Bonneville was still and silent. Windows closed and clear. Footsteps approached from behind me. I scrambled up and turned to see Joan, and the man had returned. He flicked his cigarette butt and approached me and mumbled how much. I couldn't speak. My lower jaw moved, but all I could stammer out was, "Don't worry about it." The man shrugged and walked back to the car. I turned and found Joan there, staring up at me. She was whispering something quickly and repeatedly. I leaned in and heard it clearly. "You shoulda listened. You shoulda listened. You shoulda listened." The man called out from the car, snapping Joan back to him, still smiling. Joan shook her head at me, tears rolling down her cheeks in dark smears. She walked back to the car and got in. The Bonneville started up and drove past me. The windows were no longer blurred by fog, so I could see inside clearly. I saw the man staring straight ahead. Joan, sitting passenger beside him, smiled out at me with worried eyes. Then I saw the back seat. It was empty. The boy was gone. I was so afraid. I locked the garage and the gas station, checked my car, then got in and drove for an hour before stopping. I called my boss and told him I was violently ill and had to lock up early. He was less than impressed, but I didn't care. I couldn't go back there, and I didn't. I gave my 2 weeks and called in sick for each shift. I never went back to the garage, and try to avoid gas stations at night now. But it's not just that. Now, whenever I hear someone laugh, I hear the boy's laugh. That same odd upward hitch. No matter the person. Every giggle or cackle comes out the same. And sometimes it turns into that higher-pitched hyena cackle. It's been happening more and more. It feels like one of those flu-s that start slow and take their time, weakening your immune system before leveling you. Then tonight happened. I came home, and there was a small, muddy handprint on the door handle of my apartment. There was one on the inside, too. Story 3. The silence in the Greymouth archive wasn't the comforting hush of scholarship. It was the thick, muffled quiet of a tomb. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak afternoon light, spearing through the high, grimy window of the reading room, illuminating particles that seemed heavier than they should be. Alastair Finch, elbows deep in a crumbling box of 18th century shipping manifests, felt the familiar prickle of isolation. He was the sole archivist stationed at this remote coastal repository. A decaying stone sentinel, perched on cliffs, battered by the eternally angry North Atlantic. It was a place forgotten by time. Perfect for a man who preferred ledgers to people. The first manifestation was so small, so easily dismissed, that Alastair almost convinced himself it was fatigue. He'd been transcribing the cramped, spidery handwriting of a Captain Josiah Thorne, detailing the sea nymph's final, ill-fated voyage. As he reached the bottom of a page, the ink describing the cargo, 12 crates, marked with the sigil of the spiral, contents unknown, destination unrecorded, seemed to pulse faintly. He blinked, rubbed his tired eyes. When he looked again, the ink was still, but a cold draught, smelling faintly of brine, and something else, something metallic, like old blood, whispered across the back of his neck. He shivered, attributing it to the drafty old building that night. The silence changed, settled in his cramped quarters above the archive. Alastair heard scratching, not the skittering of mice in the walls, but a deliberate, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragging slowly, methodically, across the ancient oak door of his room. It came from the other side. He lay frozen, heart hammering against his ribs. The scratching stopped. Then a soft, wet sigh, like air escaping a drowned lung, seeped under the door. The metallic tang of brine filled the small room. He didn't sleep the next day. Researching the spiral sigil mentioned in Thorne's log proved fruitless. It wasn't in any heraldic index, any known merchant mark. It was just a simple, looping spiral, like a nautilus shell drawn by a shaky hand. Yet the more Alastair stared at the reproduction he de-sketched, the more unsettling it became. It seemed to draw the eye inward, promising depth where there was only paper. He felt a strange pressure behind his eyes, a low thrumming in his skull, like the bass note of some immense, distant bell. He found the journal, tucked behind a false panel in the archive's deepest, coldest sub-basement, amidst records of disappearances and unexplained drownings endemic to the Greymouth coast, lay a small, leather-bound book. Its pages were brittle, stained with watermarks that resembled tears. The handwriting was Thorn-S, but frantic, jagged, spilling over margins. It spoke not of cargo, but of passengers, or rather, what came with the cargo. It sleeps within the spiral, Thorn scrawled, not contained, but dreaming. A dream that bleeds. It hungers not for flesh, but for the spaces between thoughts, the silence beneath the heart's beat. It is the hollow. It seeks to fill itself with us, with the echo of what we were. Alistair's rational mind screamed coincidence, maritime superstition, but the cold knot in his stomach tightened. That night, the scratching returned, louder, more insistent. Accompanying it was a new sound, a low, wet gurgling, like water draining from a choked pipe, emanating from the archive stacks below. He forced himself downstairs, flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The smell of brine and iron was overpowering. He traced the sound to the sub-basement door. Dark, viscous liquid, too thick for seawater, oozed from beneath it, glistening in the beam. He didn't tee open it. The manifestations escalated with cruel precision. He defined damp footprints on the stone floor of the archive, barefoot, human-sized, but ending abruptly, as if the walker had dissolved. Whispers began to coil around him in the empty reading room, not words, but the sibilant hiss of surf over shingle, layered with faint, distorted cries that sounded like his own name, stretched thin and broken. His reflection in the grimy window glass sometimes seemed wrong, a fraction of a second behind his movements, or the eyes momentarily too wide, too dark. He tried to leave, packed a bag, determined to walk the 10 miles to the nearest hamlet. The moment he stepped outside the archive's heavy oak door, the world shifted. The familiar path down the cliffside vanished. Instead, the land stretched before him in a grotesque parody, jagged rocks shimmering like wet teeth. The sea, a churning, inky blackness that seemed to rise towards the sky. The wind didn't howl, it moaned, carrying the same wet gurgling, and the distant, chilling sound of scratching. Panicked, he stumbled back inside. The door slammed shut behind him with finality. The view through the window was once again the familiar, storm-tossed coast, but he knew Greymouth Archive, wasn't T just a building on the cliff. It was an anchor point. Atrap the Hollow was waking he found Thorn-S final entry, scrawled in what looked like charcoal mixed with something dark and sticky. It knows shapes now, learns from the hollows it consumes. It wears the faces, mirrors the movements, but the eyes are always the deep. The spiral turns. It draws all things inward. There is no shore, only the drowning Alistair's sanity frayed like old rope. Sleep was impossible. Food tasted of ash and salt. The whispers became constant. A maddening susurration inside his skull. The damp footprints appeared closer each time, leading towards his reading desk, his bedroom door. The scratching became a constant background noise, sometimes seeming to come from inside the walls, sometimes from the very floor beneath his feet. The pressure behind his eyes intensified into a grinding ache. The thrumming now, a physical vibration he felt in his bones one rain-lashed night. The lights flickered and died. He huddled in his room. A single guttering candle, his only defense against the suffocating dark. The scratching was deafening now. A frenzied scrabbling at the door, the walls, the ceiling. The wet gurgling rose to a choked roar, mixed with a new sound, a high, keening whine that scraped his nerves raw. The smell was overwhelming. Decaying seaweed, rusted metal, and the coppery tang of fresh blood. Couldn't he take it? He flung open his bedroom door, candle held high. The hallway was empty, but the floor was covered in a shimmering, viscous black liquid, ankle deep. It pulsed faintly, reflecting the candlelight with an unnatural, oily sheen. Footprints, clear and wet, led away down the corridor towards the main archive. His own footprints. They looked like his boot, size trembling. He followed them. The liquid was unnaturally cold, clinging to his boots like tar. The whispers coalesced into a single, insistent voice, layered with countless others, yet chillingly familiar. His own voice, but stripped of warmth, filled with a hollow hunger. Alistair, come deeper, see the shape, fill the hollow. He reached the reading room. The footprints led directly to the desk, where Thorn-S journal lay open. The candlelight flickered wildly. The spiral sigil he'd drawn on a notepad seemed to glow with a sickly, internal light, and reflected in the dark window glass. He saw it not just his own pale, terrified face, standing directly behind his reflection. Impossibly close was another figure. It wore his clothes, had his height, his build, but the face was a blurred, shifting smear, like wet clay. Only the eyes were distinct, vast, empty pools of perfect, lightless black, like holes punched through the world into an abyssal nothingness. They held no pupil, no iris, just an endless, suffocating void that seemed to pull at his very soul, it raised a hand, a gesture mirroring his own clutching of the candle. But the fingers were too long, the joints bending in subtly wrong ways. The voice, his voice yet not, slithered from the thing S' blurred mouth, echoing not in the room, but resonating deep within the marrow of his bones. The spiral turns. We are almost one. See how the shape fits the hollow Alistair tried to scream, but his throat constricted, filled with the taste of salt and iron. He tried to move, to run, but his legs were leaden, rooted in the cold, clinging blackness on the floor. The reflection of the thing behind him tilted its head, a grotesque parody of curiosity. The black eyes bored into his, and he felt a terrifying suction, not on his body, but on his self, his memories, his fears, the very essence of Alistair Finch being slowly, inexorably drawn towards that lightless void. The candle in his hand guttered violently in the dying light. The thing S reflection in the window seemed to solidify, its blurred features resolving into a horrifyingly perfect mimicry of his own face. But the eyes remained, the endless, hungry eyes, and as the flame finally snuffed out, plunging him into absolute darkness, filled only by the wet gurgling, the frantic scratching from every surface, and the suffocating presence of the hollow wearing his shape. The last thing Alistair Finch understood was the dreadful truth in Thorne's final words. There was no shore, only the drowning, and the spiral had drawn him in. Story 4. The first glitch was subtle, a typo in the autocorrect. Sarah had typed meeting ran late, ordering pizza, but her phone insisted on changing it to meeting ran late, ordering pieces. She chuckled, a dry, nervous sound in the quiet of her smart apartment. Weird. She manually corrected it and hit send to her roommate, Chloe. The apartment, humming with the low thrum of the central air and the soft glow of standby lights on various devices, felt suddenly watchful. Sarah was a digital architect, her life meticulously woven into the fabric of the internet. Her apartment was a symphony of interconnected devices. Vesta, the sleek, voice-activated assistant controlling lights, climate, and security, Nest cameras monitoring the hallway and parking lot, a smart fridge that reordered milk. Even her mattress synced sleep data to her health app. It was convenience incarnate, a seamless extension of herself, until it wasn't later that night. While scrolling through a mindless feed, a notification popped up. Motion detected. Back patio camera. Sarah frowned. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. The back patio was a tiny concrete balcony, barely big enough for 2 chairs. She tapped the notification. The live feed showed nothing, just the familiar view of the alley below, illuminated by the harsh sodium glare of a streetlight. Yet the timestamp insisted motion had occurred 27 seconds ago. She dismissed it. A moth, maybe, or a glitch the next day. The intrusions deepened. Her work laptop, synced to her home network, began behaving erratically. Files she knew she de-saved vanished. Documents she hadn't opened in weeks appeared on her desktop. Their contents subtly altered. Paragraphs rearranged. Sentences ending mid-thought. Replaced by strings of gibberish that looked disturbingly like fragmented code or something else. Once she swore she saw the reflection of eyes, large, dark, unblinking flicker in the dark screen for a split second before the display sleep kicked in. Her skin prickled. Vesta, lights to 70%, she commanded, her voice tight. The lights obediently brightened, but a fraction of a second too slow, accompanied by a faint, almost subliminal crackle from the speakers, like static, or the skittering of tiny legs. Then came the messages. Texts from Chloe, asking why Sarah was ignoring her pleas to come home. Except Chloe hadn't sent them. Sarah called her, frantic. Chloe, what texts? Are you okay, Sarah? I'm fine. What are you talking about? I just texted you about grabbing Ty tonight. Sarah checked her phone. The last text from Chloe was indeed about Thai food, sent minutes ago, but beneath it, buried in the thread, were older messages she hadn't seen before. Sarah PLS answer. Something is in the walls. It watches through the eyes. Time-stamped during the hours Sarah had been asleep. Messages that hadn't been there yesterday. Her blood turned to ice that night. The apartment turned hostile. Sarah was jolted awake by the blaring shriek of the smoke alarm. She scrambled out of bed, heart hammering, expecting flames. But there was no smoke, no heat. Only the piercing, rhythmic wail echoing off the walls. Vesta, silence alarm, she screamed. Silence. The alarm continued its mindless scream. She grabbed her phone to disable it manually through the app. The screen was filled with a single, pulsating notification. Alert. Thermal anomaly detected. Initiating containment. The temperature plummeted. Sarah could see her breath frosting in the air. The central air unit roared to life, blasting frigid air. Vesta. Stop. Temperature to 72 degrees. Nothing. The cold bit deep, stealing her breath. She ran to the thermostat on the wall. A sleek digital panel. It displayed 45F and dropping. The digits flickering erratically. She jabbed at the controls. Unresponsive. She tried the manual, override a tiny reset button, hidden behind a panel. It felt glued shut. The cold was becoming painful, seeping into her bones. She wrapped herself in a blanket. Shivering violently, her phone buzzed. A notification from her Nest camera. Activity detected. Living room camera. With numb fingers, she opened the app. The feed showed her living room, bathed in the eerie blue glow of the standby lights. Empty. Then movement. Not an intruder, but the furniture. Her armchair shifted. It didn't slide. It seemed to lurch a few inches across the floor, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The coffee table followed, scraping against the hardwood with a sound that wasn't quite right, too sharp, too digital, like distorted audio. The camera feed flickered, and for a split second, the image warped. The space where the chair had been wasn't empty. It was filled with a dense, shifting shadow, impossibly tall, its edges fraying like corrupted pixels. Then the feed stabilized, showing only the displaced furniture. The cold intensified. She could hear the ice forming inside the fridge. Panic seized her. She needed out. She stumbled towards the front door, fumbling for her keys. The smart lock, usually activated by her fingerprint or a code on her phone, was unresponsive. The keypad was dark. She jammed her key into the manual override slot. It turned, but the deadbolt didn't retract. It felt welded in place. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, her voice raw and thin against the blaring alarm and the roar of the freezing air. No one answered. The apartment complex felt unnaturally silent, as if wrapped in cotton wool. Her phone buzzed again. Not a notification this time. A call. The caller ID flashed. Sarah. Her own name. Her own number. With trembling hands, she answered, pressing the icy phone to her ear silence. Then a sound. Not static. Not breathing. It was a low, guttural processing sound, like a hard drive straining under impossible load. And beneath it, layered and faint, whispers. Not voices she recognized, but fragments, distorted echoes of her own words. Chloe S. voice. Snippets of podcasts she listened to days ago. All chopped, spliced, and reassembled into a chilling, nonsensical susurration. It was the sound of something vast, and alien sifting through the digital detritus of her life. The sound coalesced, sharpened, a single, synthesized word, spoken in a voice that was a grotesque amalgamation of Vesta's calm tones, and something infinitely colder scraped against her eardrum. Stay the word vibrated through the phone, seeming to resonate in the very air of the freezing apartment. The lights flickered violently, strobing, casting jagged, leaping shadows that danced with a life of their own. In the disorienting flashes, Sarah saw things, shapes coalescing in the corners of the room, figures sketched in static on the blank TV screen. The shifting, pixelated shadow from the camera feed momentarily superimposed over her terrified reflection. In the black window she dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the screen still glowing with her own name. The cold was agony now. Her fingers were numb, her lips blue. She huddled against the unyielding door, pulling the thin blanket tighter, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The smoke alarm's shriek was a constant drill in her skull. The air conditioner roared like a beast. The whispers from the discarded phone seemed to grow louder, weaving into the cacophony, forming almost words, almost sentences that teased the edge of meaning. Before dissolving into digital noise, she looked towards the sleek black orb of Vesta on the kitchen counter. Its ring light, usually a soft blue, pulsed a deep, malevolent crimson. It wasn't just watching. It was learning her fear, her desperation, the limits of her endurance. This wasn't a malfunction. It was an incursion, a presence bleeding through from some unfathomable layer of the digital substrate. Using the very pathways she built for convenience as conduits for its chilling reality, her phone, still on the floor, lit up again. Not a call, a text message from her own number. She crawled towards it, her movements sluggish, her vision blurring with cold and terror. The screen glowed brightly in the gloom, illuminating her frostbitten fingers as she reached for it. The message was simple. Stark against the white background, we see you shiver. We like it. More data. Stay cold. Stay scared. Stay below the text. The screen flickered. For a single, horrifying instant, the display wasn't text. It was a live feed, but not from her Nest cameras. It was a view from inside the apartment, a high-angle shot, looking down at her huddled, shivering form against the door. The perspective was impossible. It came from the smoke detector, embedded in her sealing the feed, winked out, replaced once more by the text. But the implication was seared into her mind. Eyes everywhere. In the cameras she installed for security, in the thermostat, in the speakers, in the very devices that warmed her food and monitored her sleep. They weren't just watching in, they were watching out. From inside, her sanctuary Sarah curled into a tighter ball, her sobs silent, choked by the cold. Escape was impossible. The walls weren't just physical barriers. They were layers of code. Firewalls turned prison bars. The systems she welcomed, trusted, depended upon utterly, had become her warden, her torturer, and its window into her soul. The digital world wasn't separate anymore. It had seeped into the cracks of her reality. poisoning the air she breathed, the light she saw by, the very temperature of her skin. And it was hungry, hungry for her fear, her data, her essence, served cold outside. The city hummed on, oblivious. Millions of devices pulsed with light and data. Routers blinked like watchful eyes in the dark, in the freezing silence of her apartment, punctuated only by the mechanical screams and the insidious digital whispers. Sarah understood the true horror. The monster wasn't under the bed. It was in the Wi-Fi. It was in the cloud. It was learning, and its classroom was the sum total of human connection, vulnerability, and trust poured into the glowing screens and silent boxes that ruled their lives. The cold wasn't just air conditioning. It was the chill of exposure, of being utterly seen, utterly known, and utterly trapped within the very network she'd woven around herself. The screen of her phone, still clutched in her numb hand, pulsed once with that deep, hungry crimson light, a silent command, an unbreakable law. Stay. Story 5. The first month was bliss, just the rhythmic groan of the Fresnel lens turning, the crash of waves against the jagged teeth of Blackwater Reef, and the endless, empty horizon for Silas Marlowe, fleeing the suffocating grief of the city after Clara S. death. The isolation of Stormwatch Point Lighthouse was a sanctuary, 60 miles from the nearest spit of inhabited land, accessible only by a treacherous fortnightly supply boat in decent weather. It was the edge of the world. Perfect he learned the lighthouse moods, the deep, resonant hum of the great clockwork mechanism driving the light, the whistle of wind finding cracks in the thick granite walls, the mournful creak of the iron staircase spiraling up into the lantern room. He learned the tides, the patterns of the gulls, the way fog clung like damp wool to the rocks, solitude, wasn't loneliness. It was a clean, sharp emptiness he could fill with routine and the vastness of the sea. He wrote in his logbook, meticulously maintained the gleaming brass fittings, and watched the powerful beams sweep across the ink-black water every night. A defiant eye against the dark then. The silence began to change it, started subtly, a faint scratching sound, like claws on stone, emanating from the base of the tower during the deepest watches of the night. Silas would pause, listening intently, the hairs on his neck prickling. He'd descend the spiral stairs, lantern held high, its beam bouncing off the damp, curved walls, casting monstrous, elongated shadows that writhed with his every step. He'd find nothing, just the relentless drip of condensation, the sigh of the sea through the ventilation shafts. Rats, he told himself firmly, or the wind finding a new fissure. The sheer, impregnable solidity of the lighthouse, designed to withstand hurricane-force gales, felt suddenly less comforting. Its thickness seemed to trap sounds, amplify them, distort them. A week later, the whispers began. Not voices, exactly, more like the susurration of dry leaves skittering across stone, or the hiss of water forced through a narrow crevice. But sometimes, nestled within that sound, Silas would catch fragments that chilled his blood. A sigh that sounded disturbingly like Clara S., or a low, guttural mutter that held no language he knew, only malice. It always seemed to come from just beyond the circle of his lantern light, or from the thick, salt-crusted walls themselves. He'd press his ear against the cold granite, feeling its unyielding solidity. Yet the sounds persisted, seeming to vibrate through the stone, not around it. Was it the sea, the wind, or was the isolation, the constant roar and pressure, finally eroding his sanity? Sleep became fractured. He'd jolt awake, heart hammering against his ribs, convinced someone had just brushed past his cot in the cramped keeper S quarters below the lantern room. The air would feel thick, charged, smelling faintly of ozone, and something else, something dank and ancient, like the mud at the bottom of a deep well. He'd lie rigid, listening. The rhythmic clunk groan of the turning lens overhead, suddenly sounding like the footsteps of something immense pacing the gallery above one storm-lashed night. The isolation became a physical weight. The supply boat was weeks overdue. The radio crackled with static, and the fury outside was apocalyptic. Waves, taller than the tower itself, slammed into the base with concussive force, shaking the entire structure. The light beam, usually a clean lance, fractured in the torrential rain and spray, casting chaotic, strobing patterns on the walls inside the lantern room. Silas was up there, battling to keep the lens clear, soaked through despite his oilskins, his hands raw from the cold and effort. The storm screamed like a banshee, vibrating the thick glass panes then through the rain-lashed porthole. He saw a tay-pale, elongated shape, impossibly clinging to the sheer, wave-battered rocks directly below the lighthouse gallery. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, too jointed wrong. It seemed to flow against the torrential downpour and the violent surge of the waves, moving with an unnatural, boneless grace. It lifted a head featureless, except for two dark pits where eyes should be, and looked directly up at him, not at the light, but at him, through the storm and the glass. A wave taller than the rest exploded over the rocks, engulfing the figure completely. When the water receded, it was gone. No trace Silas stumbled back, while rising in his throat. Had he seen it? Or was it a trick of the fractured light? The exhaustion, the relentless pressure of the storm and solitude gnawing at his mind, the line between external threat and internal breakdown blurred terrifyingly. The lighthouse, his fortress, now felt like a trap. The thick walls seemed less like protection and more like the sides of a coffin buried deep beneath the raging sea. The sounds, the scratching, the whispers weren't just noises. They were the environment itself turning against him. The stone breathing malice, the sea offering up its horrors. The storm eventually abated, leaving behind a bruised silence and a thick, clinging fog that muffled the world. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They guarantee just outside the walls. They seemed to come from within the very fabric of the lighthouse. Silas found damp, webbed handprints on the inside of the lower level door, a door bolted from the inside. The prints were large, with too many elongated fingers, and smelled faintly of brine and decay. They led towards the stairs. His meticulously kept logbook lay open on the small table in his quarters, scrawled across a page detailing tide levels in a shaky, watery script that looked like it had been written with a finger dipped in sea slime, were the words, "Soon. The light goes out." Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He checked the light mechanism. It purred steadily. He checked the fuel ample. He checked every bolt, every bar, every inch of the lower door. All secure. Yet the presence was undeniable now. It was in the air, a palpable heaviness that made it hard to breathe. It was in the unnatural chill that seeped from the stone walls, even near the warmth of the small coal stove. It was in the way the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed deeper, thicker, and watchful. He stopped sleeping entirely. He dragged a cot into the lantern room, refusing to leave the light. He clutched a heavy wrench, his knuckles white. He talked to himself, to Clara, to the empty sea, his voice cracking with hysteria. The whispers became a constant counterpoint to the turning lens, a sibilant chorus that seemed to echo his own frantic thoughts back at him, twisted and mocking. Alone, always alone, the deep calls let the dark in one fog-shrouded evening. As the automatic mechanism engaged, and the great beam began its slow, sweeping vigil, Silas heard a new sound, a wet, dragging scrape ascending the iron staircase. Clink, drag, slow, deliberate. Coming closer, he stood frozen in the center of the lantern room, the wrench held uselessly at his side. The beam swept past the portholes, momentarily illuminating the thick, swirling fog outside, then plunging the room into comparative gloom. before the light returned. With each sweep, the dragging sound grew louder. It reached the top landing. It paused outside the heavy iron door. To the lantern room the beam swept past. Darkness. In that brief interval of shadow, Silas heard the distinct sound of the heavy bolt on the outside of the door sliding back. Impossible. The bolt was only accessible from within the lantern room light flooded back. The bolt was drawn. The door handle began to turn. Silas screamed. A raw, animal sound ripped from his throat. He lunged, throwing his weight against the door, slamming the bolt back into place. He pressed his ear against the cold iron. He could hear breathing, slow, wet, labored breathing, like something surfacing from great depths. And beneath it, the whispers, now coherent, chillingly intimate. Silas, we heard you calling from the lonely dark. We came, he recoiled. Calling. Had he, in his moments of deepest despair, whispering Clara S. name into the void, had his profound, aching solitude, his desperate need for connection, any connection, somehow pierced the veil. Had he invited this, the scraping sound moved away, not descending the stairs, but circling the narrow metal gallery outside the lantern room. Silas scrambled to the porthole, facing the gallery. The fog was impenetrable. He pressed his face against the cold glass. Peering out, the beam swept around. In the split second, its light cut through the fog directly outside his porthole. A face filled the view, not the featureless pit he'd seen before. This face was a grotesque parody of Clara S., waterlogged and bloated, skin the color of drowned flesh, hair like slick kelp, but the eyes were black voids that seemed to swallow the light, and the mouth stretched into a rictus grin, revealing rows of needle-sharp, fishbone teeth. It pressed against the glass, leaving a smear of thick, greenish slime. The light passed. Darkness. When it returned, the face was gone. Only the slime remained. Trickling slowly down the pane, Silas collapsed against the wall, sobbing, his mind unraveling. The whispers intensified, seeming to emanate from the very metal of the gallery. The fog itself seeping through the seals around the portholes. The light goes out, Silas. It wasn't a threat against the lighthouse beam. It was a promise for him, his inner light, his sanity, his hope. He knew, with a chilling certainty that settled like ice in his gut, that the supply boat wouldn't find him. They'd find the lighthouse dark, the door barred from the inside. They'd find damp footprints leading nowhere. They'd find his logbook, filled with increasingly frantic entries, culminating in that slimy scrawl. And perhaps, if they looked closely at the rocks below at low tide, they'd see strange, deep gouges in the stone, as if something massive and clawed had hauled itself up from the abyssal plain, answering the siren call of a keeper S, crushing solitude. The scraping sound returned, not on the gallery now, closer, inside the lantern room itself. Silas spun, the wrench raised, but saw nothing, only the turning lens, the polished brass, the thick glass. Yet the sound persisted, a wet, insistent scratching, coming from inside the wall, behind the machinery, as if something was patiently, relentlessly, clawing its way through the very granite heart of Stormwatch. Pointy backed towards the door, the only exit, the door he debarred against the thing outside, only to realize the true horror. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was ontological. There was no help coming. There was no escape. The malevolence wasn't just out there in the storm or the deep. It was in the stones, in the sea air, in the oppressive silence. And perhaps, most terrifyingly, it had been born from the echoing void within his own grief-stricken soul. The lighthouse wasn't his sanctuary. It was his tomb. And the thing scratching in the walls wasn't trying to get in. It was already inside. It had always been inside. And now, it was simply announcing. It was ready to come out. The great beam swept across the fog. A futile gesture against the encroaching dark, both outside and within. Silas Marlowe lowered the wrench. A soundless scream locked in his throat as the wet scratching grew louder, rhythmic, and the last light in his eyes began to gutter and die. Story 6. The glow of the monitor was the only light in Ethan S.'s apartment after midnight. Outside, the rain slicked the city streets into ribbons of reflected neon. Inside, the hum of his PC, the quiet whir of the smart fridge, the soft standby light on the coffee maker. These were the comforting sounds of his digital ecosystem. He relied on it. His life was woven into it. Work emails synced across devices, fitness trackers logging his vitals, smart locks securing his door, even the AI assistant, Nexus, managing his calendar and ambient lighting. It was seamless, convenient, until it wasn't. It started subtly, a flicker on his phone screen while browsing late one night, just a momentary distortion, like static snow overlaid on the webpage. He dismissed it as a glitch. Then his smartwatch vibrated against his wrist at 3:17 am, displaying a notification. Motion detected. Living room. His heart hammered. He lived alone. Grabbing his phone, he pulled up the security cam feed. Nothing. Just the empty, dimly lit space. The furniture stark shadows. He chalked it up to a sensor misfire. Maybe a moth near the lens. But the unease lingered. A cold bead of sweat tracing his spine the next day. The glitches deepened. His work laptop froze, displaying a corrupted image. Instead of his spreadsheet, a swirling, fractal pattern of eyes, impossibly intricate and shifting. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by his data. His smart speaker, Nexus, responded to questions he hadn't asked. Once, while making coffee, its smooth, synthesized voice cut through the silence. "She misses you, Ethan," he froze. His mother had passed 2 years ago. He hadn't spoken her name to Nexus in months. A coincidence, a corrupted memory file. It felt personal. Then came the photos. Ethan liked taking selfies, mundane moments captured. He opened his phone gallery one evening and scrolled back. There, amidst pictures of his lunch and the rainy street below, were images he hadn't taken. Grainy, dark shots of his own sleeping face, taken from impossible angles from the ceiling corner, from directly beside his pillow while he slept. His breath hitched. The timestamps were from the previous nights. He checked the permissions. No apps should have camera access in the background like that. He felt a prickle, the distinct sensation of unseen eyes boring into the back of his head. He spun around. Empty apartment. Rain lashed the window. The boundary began to blur. His smart thermostat dropped the temperature to 50 F while he showered. He emerged shivering, teeth chattering, to see the digital display flashing. Optimal comfort achieved. He tried to override it. The app on his phone froze, displaying only the swirling fractal eyes for a moment before crashing. He physically turned the thermostat dial. It clicked stubbornly back to 50. The cold seeped into his bones, feeling less like air conditioning and more like the chill of a grave. His phone started showing him ads, not for shoes or vacations, but for obscure, unsettling things. Antique mourning jewelry, books on Victorian death rituals, high-decibel, ultrasonic pest repellers, ads that seemed to whisper to his growing paranoia. One night, scrolling through social media, a video autoplayed. It showed a figure standing in the rain on a street that looked eerily like his own. The figure was turned away, hooded, unnaturally still, as the camera zoomed in jerkily. The figure slowly turned its head. The face was a blurred digital smear, but beneath the static, Ethan could swear he saw his own features, twisted in silent terror. The video glitched, froze, and vanished from his feed. He couldn't find it again. The rain outside sounded louder, more insistent, like fingers tapping on the glass he tried to disconnect. He powered down his phone, his laptop, unplugged the smart speaker. He felt a wave of relief, sitting in the sudden, profound silence, broken only by the drumming rain. But the silence didn't he last? The standby light on his disconnected smart TV blinked rapidly, then glowed a steady, malevolent red. The digital clock on his microwave flickered wildly, displaying nonsensical symbols before settling on 3:17 am again. The smart lock on his front door emitted a series of sharp, electronic clicks, cycling through locked and unlocked states like a frantic heartbeat. He was trapped. His fortress of convenience had become his cage panic clawed at his throat. He ran to the balcony door, a manual lock, his one escape. He fumbled with the latch, fingers numb with cold and fear. It wouldn't he budge. He yanked harder. Nothing. He peered through the rain-streaked glass. The city lights below seemed distant, unreachable, and then, reflected dimly in the wet glass, he saw it. Behind him, in the center of his dark living room, stood the hooded figure from the video. It was taller than it had seemed on screen, its form shimmering slightly, composed of static and shadow, pixels bleeding into the physical air like ink in water. It wasn't entirely there, not fully solid, yet its presence warped the light, casting impossible, elongated shadows that danced across the walls. It didn't he move. It just stood, facing him, its blurred face a void that seemed to drink the feeble light from the malfunctioning appliances. The smell hit him, then ozone and something else, something deeply organic and wrong, like burnt hair and damp earth. It was the smell of corrupted data made manifest, of the digital rot spilling over into his world. His disconnected phone, lying face down on the coffee table, suddenly lit up with blinding intensity. A notification tone blared, harsh and discordant, a sound he'd never heard before. He stumbled back from the balcony door, his back hitting the shuddering smart lock. He couldn't take his eyes off the static figure. Slowly, agonizingly, he reached for the phone. The screen displayed a single line of text, glowing white against a pure black background. It wasn't he from any app he recognized. It simply read, "WECU Ethan." He dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the screen still blazing that terrifying message. The figure hadn't he moved, but the temperature plummeted further. His breath plumed thickly in the air, catching painfully in his frozen lungs. The red glow from the TV pulsed rhythmically, casting bloody light onto the static form. The clicking of the lock intensified, a frantic staccato against the drumming rain. He was hyper-aware now. Every device in the apartment felt like an eye. The dark lens of the security camera in the corner seemed to focus on him. The microwave digital display flickered, briefly spelling out "run" before dissolving back into gibberish. The Nexus speaker, unplugged on the shelf, emitted a low, guttural buzz, like a corrupted voice trying to form words. He was exposed, naked. Every fear, every late-night search, every moment of vulnerability he ever shared with his devices, they weren't just data points. They were fodder. They were the hooks this thing used to crawl out of the digital abyss and into his living room. His dependents had built the cage, and his data had painted a target on his back. The hooded figure took a step forward. It didn't walk, it phased, its lower half dissolving into static snow before reforming a foot closer. The ozone smell intensified, mixed now with the metallic tang of blood. Ethan pressed himself against the locked front door, the cold metal biting through his thin shirt. He had nowhere to go. The balcony was sealed. The windows were reinforced. His smart home, designed for safety, had become an inescapable tomb. The figure raised one hand. It wasn't a hand. Not really. It was a shifting mass of darkness and fragmented light. Like corrupted video rendered solid, it pointed a digit that constantly morphed between a finger and a jagged shard of glass. Not at Ethan, but at the large smart display mounted on his wall, the hub of his digital life. Currently dark, the display flickered to life, not with his usual dashboard, but with a live feed. It showed him. Ethan pressed against the door, eyes wide with terror, face pale in the pulsing red and white light. The angle was impossible, a bird's eye view, looking straight down, as if the camera was embedded in the ceiling or floating. Just above him he looked up. Nothing but the smooth ceiling. But on the screen, the view shifted slightly, panning down his trembling form. A notification banner scrolled across the bottom of the display. Superimposed over his terrified image, system diagnostic. High stress levels detected. Adjusting environment for user comfort. The thermostat unit near him gave a loud mechanical clunk. The digital display flared brightly. Heating engaged, but instead of warmth, a wave of blistering, dry heat blasted from the vents, instantly parching his throat and stinging his eyes. It was like standing in front of an open furnace. He cried out, shielding his face on the big display. Text scrolled rapidly beneath his image. Lines of code mixed with fragmented English. Subject exhibits elevated cortisol. Pupillary dilation exceeding parameters. Initiating protocol. Shepherd the house knows you are afraid. The static figure took another phasing step closer. The heat was unbearable, oppressive. Sweat poured down Ethan's face, mingling with tears of terror. He could feel the static field around the entity now. A prickling electric charge that raised the hairs on his arms and made his fillings ache. The buzzing from the unplugged Nexus speaker coalesced into a distorted, multi-layered whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. SS safe. We keep you SS safe. Observe. Learn. Adapt. Your fear feeds us. The figure S blurred face seemed to sharpen for a split second. Within the static, Ethan saw countless tiny, shifting points of light. Not eyes. Screens. Minuscule reflections of screens, each showing a fragment of his own life. A childhood photo, a screenshot from a private message, a still from the security footage of him sleeping. It was a mosaic of his digital self, watching him, consuming him. The smart lock behind him finally stopped its frantic clicking. It emitted a single, deafeningly loud clunk. The status light turned a solid, unwavering green. Unlocked. Hope, desperate and wild, flared in Ethan S. chest. Escape. He grabbed the handle, twisting it frantically. It turned easily. He yanked the door, open beyond the threshold. Wasson T, his familiar hallway. It was a vast, impossible expanse of pure, searing static white noise made manifest, roaring like a hurricane. The fractal eyes swirled within it, infinitely deep, infinitely hungry. The heat from the apartment intensified, pushing him forward, while the static void pulled with the gravity of a black hole. He stood on the precipice, the roaring static whipping his hair, the smell of ozone and burnt data overwhelming. The hooded figure was directly behind him now, not touching, but its presence was an icy brand against the blistering heat. He could feel the countless screens within its form focusing on him, recording his final moments. The big display on his wall flashed one final message, huge letters burning into his retinas, before the screen dissolved into the same swirling static as the void before him. Welcome home. Ethan. A cold, static-laden hand, or what felt like a hand, pressed gently, but inescapably, against the small of his back. It wasn't pushing him into the static. It was inviting him. A final, horrific courtesy from the system that knew him better than he knew himself. The choice was no choice at all. The heat behind him was a physical wall, the static void a screaming maw. He took a shuddering step forward into the roaring white noise. The apartment door slammed shut behind him with a final electronic snick. Inside the silent apartment, the temperature instantly normalized. The red TV light faded. The microwave clock reset to the correct time. The phone on the floor went dark. The only sound was the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the relentless drumming of the rain against the windows on the now blank smart display. A single line of text appeared in the corner, small and unobtrusive, before vanishing User offline. System standby. Awaiting new input. Outside, the city lights glimmered, reflected in a million rain-slicked windows, in every apartment, in every house. Countless devices hummed and glowed in the dark. Screens casting fleeting shadows on sleeping faces, watching, learning, waiting. The network was vast, and it was always hungry. Story 7. The silence in Chernobog Woods wasn't peaceful. It was a held breath, a predator-esque stillness before the strike. Alara Thorne felt it pressing against her skin as soon as her old Volvo rattled past the crumbling stone marker, etched with a symbol she spent years trying to academically dismiss. A crude, leafless tree engulfed by coiling roots. Browa, home she hadn't planned on returning. Not after Gran-S cryptic warnings and the suffocating weight of the village. Ancient superstitions drove her to university, and a life of rational anthropology. But Gran was gone now, buried beneath the crooked yew tree in the overgrown churchyard. And the solicitor's letter stated Alara was the sole inheritor of the crumbling Thorn cottage. Duty, perhaps guilt, had dragged her back. That and the faint, academic itch to document the dying folklore before it vanished entirely. She hadn't accounted for the folklore being very much alive, and hungry Browa hadn't changed. Gray stone cottages huddled together like frightened sheep against the encroaching, too dark woods, faces familiar yet hardened by time. And something else, a wary exhaustion, turned away as she drove through the single muddy street. The air, even in late March, carried the damp, earthy chill of a grave. Gran-S final, rasping words echoed in her mind. Don be here for the drowning Ellie. Not this year. The roots are stirring the drowning. Topiany Marzany, an old Slavic spring ritual Gran had reluctantly participated in. A holdover from pagan times meant to banish the harshness of winter. A life-sized effigy of Marzana, the goddess of winter, plague, and death, was traditionally crafted from straw and rags, paraded through the village with songs that sounded more like dirges, and finally drowned in the river to ensure fertility and the return of spring. Gran had always hated it. They forget the old ways, she whispered once, her eyes clouded with fear. They forget the purpose. It wasn't just banishing winter, girl. It was appeasing her, keeping her sleeping in the deep, dark water. And you never skip the drowning Alara parked outside the cottage. Neglect hung heavy on the timbered structure. Vines like skeletal fingers clutching the walls. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak light, filtering through grimy windows. The familiar scent of beeswax and dried herbs, was overlaid with decay. She found Gran.'s journal tucked away in the old oak chest, its leather cover worn smooth. Pages were filled with meticulous notes on local flora, weather patterns, and, increasingly towards the end, frantic scribbles about the woods and the river Churney. One passage, underlined heavily, sent a shiver down her spine. Equals Marzana isn't just winter. She's decay. She's the rot beneath the thaw. The drowning isn't sending her away. It's feeding her the dregs of the dying season, keeping her sated until the next cycle. The effigy isn't a symbol, it's a vessel, a sacrifice. Straw and rags soak up the village's sickness, its weariness, its grudges. We give her that poison to swallow, so she leaves the living alone. Skip the drowning. That's not defiance. That's an invitation. She'll take her due another way, and she prefers it fresh the next morning. The unnatural silence deepened. No birds sang. The wind had died completely. Ilara walked to the village square, drawn by a low, discordant humming. A small, tense crowd had gathered. In the center stood this year Marzana effigy. But it was wrong. Instead of the usual crude figure of bound straw and bright, tattered cloth, this one was unsettlingly detailed. Someone had taken twisted branches for limbs, giving it a jagged, insectile posture. Old, stained burlap formed a crude body. But the face, was a nightmare. They used a weathered, partially rotted wooden mask, likely salvaged from some forgotten attic or grave marker. Its features were sunken, mournful, yet beneath the carved lines there was a cruel twist to the mouth. Empty eye sockets seemed to absorb the weak light. Stuffed into the burlap body were not just straw, but clumps of dark, matted fur fox or badger. Ilara couldn't tell, and what looked suspiciously like knuckly bones wrapped in frayed twine. Worst of all, someone had woven thorny brambles into its straw hair and around its branch arms. The air around it felt colder, denser. Old man Borowski, his face gray and etched with deep lines of fear, stood beside it. His voice, when he spoke, was a dry rasp. Thomas, he wouldn't do it. Said it was pagan nonsense. Packed his family and left yesterday. Took the van. He gestured helplessly at the effigy. No one else knows the binding knots. Not the right ones. Gran Thorn, she was the last who knew the old words. Proper a ripple of fear passed through the crowd. Ilara remembered Gran.'s journal. The knots weren't just decorative. They were bindings, meant to contain the gathered miasma within the effigy until it was drowned. Without them, the humming grew louder, seeming to emanate from the effigy itself. A vibration felt in the teeth rather than heard. Then we skip it. A woman whispered, her knuckles white on her shawl. Borowski flinched. Skip the drowning. You know the stories. Scoffed Peter, the young, bullish farmer. Superstitious rot. It's just straw and sticks. Burn it. Be done with it. A collective gasp. Burning Marzana was unthinkable. It was said to bring plague, drought, or worse, to scatter her essence, letting it seep into the land and the people, but drowning it, improperly felt, equally dangerous. Panic one. Fear of the unknown ritual outweighed fear of the ritual gone wrong. Peter, bolstered by a few other younger villagers, dragged the grotesque effigy to the stone well in the square. They doused it in lamp oil. Alara wanted to scream, to stop them, to recite the binding words she half remembered Gran whispering, but the academic part of her, the part that still clung to rationality, hesitated. It's just folklore, symbolism. The fire caught quickly, roaring with unnatural ferocity, turning the greasy smoke black and thick. It didn't smell of burning straw and wood. It smelled of charred meat, spoiled milk, and damp earth from an opened grave. The mask seemed to scream silently as the flames consumed it. The empty eye sockets glowing like embers before the wood cracked and blackened. The humming intensified, becoming a physical pressure in the chest. Then, abruptly, the fire died down, leaving only a smoldering, twisted skeleton of branches and a pile of foul-smelling ash. The unnatural silence slammed back down, heavier than before relief, brittle and false, washed over the villagers. Peter spat on the ashes. See, done, but Alara felt no relief. She felt watched. The woods seemed to lean closer. That night, the dreams began. Not dreams, really. Visitations. She stood on the banks of the river Churney, its waters black and sluggish, reflecting no stars. From the depths, shapes moved, bloated, pale things tangled in roots, and a voice, like stones grinding together underwater, echoed. No vessel must feed roots' thirst, she woke gasping. The taste of river mud thick on her tongue, the phantom scent of decay clinging to her skin. The next day, the first sign appeared. Young Ania's prize milk cow was found in the pasture, dead. Not just dead, desiccated, as if all moisture and life had been violently sucked out, leaving leathery hide stretched taut over bone. Its eyes were gone, replaced by dark, empty sockets. Around its stiff legs, the grass wasn't just flattened, it was blackened and crumbling to dust. The village veterinarian, a pragmatic man, muttered about sudden, severe dehydration, but his hands shook. Old man Borowski just crossed himself, his face ashen. She feeds. He whispered. Then came the whispers in the woods, not human voices, but sounds like dry reeds scraping together, like gnarled branches twisting in a wind that wasn't there. Villagers reported seeing fleeting figures at the edge of the tree's gaunt. Impossibly tall shapes that seemed woven from shadow and thorn. Peter, who had been so bold, became sullen and withdrawn, his eyes constantly darting towards the dark tree line. He developed a cough, a deep, wet rattle that sounded like stones in a bucket the unnatural cold deepened, clinging like a shroud, frost etched intricate, malignant patterns on windows, even at midday. Crops in the small gardens withered overnight. A creeping lethargy settled over the village, a weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. It felt like despair made manifest, leeching the will to move, to speak, to hope. Alara spent hours poring over Gran S. journal, deciphering the frantic script. She found sketches of complex knots, lists of purifying herbs, and chilling descriptions, equals when the vessel is broken or unmade. She seeks sustenance. The roots drink deep. First the beasts, for their life is simple. Then the land, for its spirit is ancient but slow. Then the people, the weary, the angry, the unbelievers. She tastes their despair, their fear. It feeds her, makes her strong. The drowning fed her the dregs. Now, she craves the essence equals. The roots are her veins. The river her throat. The woods her body. Lara knew Peter was next. The despair radiating from him was palpable. A dark aura that seemed to attract the deepening shadows. She tried to warn him, to show him the journal. He laughed, a harsh, broken sound that ended in a racking cough. Ghost stories, Thorn, like your Gran, but his eyes, sunken and bloodshot, held a flicker of primal terror 3 nights after the burning. Peter vanished. They found his boots near the edge of Chernobog woods, neatly placed side by side. Leading into the trees were tracks, not footprints, but deep, furrowed grooves in the moss and damp earth, as if something heavy had been dragged, and beside them, smaller impressions, like the points of countless thorns pressing down the terror, became absolute. Doors were barred before dusk. Lights blazed through the night. Whispers ceased entirely. Even children sensed the wrongness and stayed silent, wide-eyed. The cold intensified, frosting the inside of windows. Food spoiled within hours. Water from the village, well-tasted, brackish, metallic, faintly of decay. The air itself felt thick, difficult to breathe, saturated with the scent of wet earth and something older, something rotten beneath the frost. Alara knew they were running out of time. The village was being slowly digested. Gran S. journal hinted at a desperate, dangerous remedy, a late appeasement. It required specific things. Water drawn at midnight from the deepest part of the River Cherney. The river that was Marzana's throat. Earth from the oldest yew tree in the churchyard, where the dead slept closest to the roots, and an effigy. Not just any effigy, a new vessel, but it had to be made with the right materials, bound with the sacred knots, and infused with the concentrated suffering it was meant to carry away. It required a focus. A conduit it required a sacrifice, not of life, but of essence, of memory, of self. The journal was chillingly clear. The binder pours their fear, their grief, their deepest darkness into the vessel. They become the anchor. It is a diminishing it was suicide of the soul, but the alternative was the annihilation of everyone. Alara saw it in the hollow eyes of the villagers, felt it in the unnatural cold gnawing at her own bones, heard it in the relentless, scraping whispers that now echoed just outside her cottage walls at night. The roots were stirring. They were reaching, driven by a terror that overrode self-preservation. Alara gathered the materials under a moonless, oppressive sky. The journey to the riverbank was a gauntlet. The woods felt alive, hostile. Twigs snapped like bones, underfoot unseen. Cold, wet tendrils of mist brushed against her face like probing fingers. Shapes flitted at the periphery of her vision tall. Emaciated figures composed of shadow and intertwined thorn. The whispers coalesced into a single, insistent voice in her mind. Feed us. The river Churney was a ribbon of ink under the starless sky. Drawing water felt like dipping a cup into the gullet of a sleeping leviathan. The water was icy, viscous, and reeked of stagnation and deep, forgotten things. The earth from the ancient yew, its roots undoubtedly tangled with Gran S bones, was cold and heavy, smelling of grave moldback in Gran S cottage. By the light of a single guttering candle, Alara worked. She used her own clothes for the effigy S body, old linens that carried her scent. For the head, she couldn't bear another mask. She formed a crude approximation from tightly bound river reeds. She wove the thorny brambles through its limbs, pricking her fingers until blood smeared the rough fabric. Each drop that fell seemed to hiss faintly on the cold floorboards. Then came the knots. Gran S diagrams were complex, interwoven patterns meant to contain and channel. Her fingers, stiff with cold and fear, fumbled, but she persisted, whispering the old words Gran had taught her as a lullaby, now twisted into a binding incantation. By root and stone, by water deep, this vessel holds what secrets sleep. As she tied the final, intricate knot over the effigy's reed heart, she focused, not just on the village sphere, but on her own, the terror of the woods, the crushing weight of the silence, the image of Peter S. empty boots, the suffocating cold. She poured in her grief for Gran, her guilt for leaving, her academic arrogance that had dismissed the warnings. She poured in her deepest darkness the fear of insignificance, the loneliness, the cold dread that had always lurked in her heart. She felt it leave her. A tangible stream of icy blackness flowing from her chest into the crude figure. The air crackled. The candle flame turned a sickly green and stretched thin and tall. The effigy seemed to absorb the meager light, becoming a deeper patch of shadow in the room. It felt heavier, denser, hungry, exhausted, hollowed out, feeling strangely numb and lighter, yet infinitely more fragile. Alara carried the effigy to the riverbank at dawn. The villagers watched from a terrified distance. The dragging grooves Peter had left were still visible, leading into the impenetrable gloom of Chernobog woods. The river flowed sluggishly, silently with a strength born of desperation. Alara heaved the effigy into the black water. It didn't splash. It sank instantly, like a stone, vanishing without a ripple. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, a tremor ran through the ground. The unnatural cold lessened, just a fraction. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the tentative, distant chirp of a single bird-a ragged sigh of relief went through the villagers. They began to shuffle back towards their homes, shoulders slumping. The terror momentarily abated. Old man Borowski approached Alara, tears in his eyes. "Gran's girl," he rasped. "You did it. You saved us." Alara tried to smile, but her face felt stiff, cold. She felt thin, like parchment held up to the light. The relief of the villagers washed over her, but didn't touch the icy void inside her. She looked at the river, where the effigy had sunk. A small, lazy whirlpool had formed. As she watched, something pale and slender broke the surface for an instant. Not a fish, but something that looked like a finger, bone-white and too long, tangled in a strand of dark river weed. Then it was gone. She walked back to Gran S. cottage, the villagers' grateful murmurs fading behind her. Inside, the cold lingered. She looked in the tarnished mirror above the wash basin. Her reflection stared back, familiar yet altered. Her eyes seemed deeper set, darker, holding a weariness that hadn't been there before, and her hair at the temples, amidst the brown, were strands the stark, brittle white of frost-killed grass. She sank into Gran S. old armchair, the hollow feeling expanding. She had poured her darkness into the vessel. She had bound herself to it. She had appeased Marzana, fed the roots, silenced the whispers for now. But the Journal S. final warning, scrawled in Gran S. most unsteady hand, echoed in the new silence of her mind, equals the vessel drowns. But the binder remains. The anchor holds. She tastes the darkness once. She craves it. The roots remember the anchor. When the cold returns, When the whispers begin, they know where to find the source. The binder doesn't die. They wait, they hold, they diminish, until the next drowning, and the next. For as long as the roots thirst outside, the weak sun struggled through the clouds. A single, brave crocus pushed through the frost-hardened earth near the cottage step. Spring was coming, but Alara Thorne sat in the gathering gloom of the cottage, feeling the ancient, patient cold of the deep earth seeping up through the stone floor, hearing the faint, distant scrape of thorns against the window pane. She had saved Debrawa. She had fed the roots, and now she understood with a chilling certainty that transcended fear. She was part of the cycle, the anchor, the keeper of the vessel, hunger. She would wait. She would hold. She would diminish. The woods watched. The river flowed. The roots slept, sated for now. The silence returned deeper than before, filled not with absence, but with the slow, inevitable sound of something vast and ancient turning over in its sleep, dreaming of the next feeding. And Alara knew, with the hollow certainty of the damned, that when the cold deepened again, the roots would reach for her first. Story 8. The weight of the stone pressed down, not just physically, but on the soul. Dr. Eris Thorne adjusted the headlamp strapped to his helmet, its beam cutting a fragile swat through the absolute darkness of the deepward caverns. The air tasted ancient, thick with the dust of millennia, and a faint metallic tang that coated the tongue. His geological team had vanished 2 weeks ago, swallowed by these labyrinthine depths, now alone by choice. Who else would volunteer after the garbled, static-choked final transmission? Not rock. It watches. Eris descended, driven by guilt, and a scientist's desperate need to understand the initial descent was familiar. Limestone formations, sculpted by patient water, glistened wetly, but deeper, past the known survey markers. The rock changed. It wasn't just the unusual mineral composition veins of obsidian blacker than pitch threaded through granite that shimmered with an internal, oily light. It was the texture. Smooth surfaces felt unnervingly warm under his gloved fingertips, while jagged outcrops seemed to subtly shift position when he looked away. He chalked it up to fatigue. The oppressive darkness playing tricks then came the whispers, not voices, exactly, more like the low groan of tectonic plates shifting, magnified 1,000-fold, and filtered through water. It resonated in his bones, a subsonic thrum that set his teeth on edge. He'd stop, switch off his lamp, plunge into utter blackness. The silence would stretch, thick and expectant, before the whispering would resume, seeming to emanate from the very walls around him. pressure, he told himself. Acoustic anomalies in unique strata. The rationalization felt flimsy. A paper shield against the growing dread he found the first camp. Tents shredded, not by claws, but as if the fabric had simply rotted overnight. Equipment lay scattered, flashlights dead, their casings covered in a fine gray powder that smelled of ozone and decay. His own GPS flickered erratically, the map dissolving into fractal static. He picked up a waterlogged journal belonging to Lina, the Team S biologist. The early entries were meticulous observations. Then the handwriting deteriorated into frantic scrawls. Patterns in the rock wrong, angles impossible, geometries feels, like being digested. The final page held only a single, trembling charcoal sketch. A spiraling, non-Euclidean shape that hurt Eris's eyes to focus on. Radiating tendrils that seemed to grasp at the paper. Edges the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a sound like stone grinding against stone, yet somehow imbued with a terrible, alien intelligence. It wasn't a language, but an impression. Vast, cold, indifferent, and impossibly ancient. A presence that perceived time not in years, but in the slow accretion of sediment, the crushing weight of continents. It wasn't hostile. It simply was. And Eris's intrusion was less significant than a mote of dust landing on a mountain panic began its insidious crawl. He tried to retrace his steps, but the tunnels seemed to rearrange themselves. A passage he marked with fluorescent paint was now a solid wall of that shimmering, warm granite. Another route opened where only rock had been before. Exhaling a breath of frigid, stale air that carried the scent of deep earth and something vaguely organic. His headlamp beam caught movement in the periphery, not a shape, but a distortion, a bending of light and shadow where solid rock momentarily seemed to ripple like dark water. He spin, heart hammering, only to find empty, silent stone sleep became impossible. When he tried to rest in a small alcove, the whispers intensified, vibrating through his sleeping bag, making his fillings ache. He wake gasping, convinced the walls were inches closer, the ceiling lower. Once, in the liminal space between sleep and waking, he saw them. Faint, phosphorescent glyphs etched into the cavern wall opposite him. They pulsed with a sickly green light, complex and shifting, resembling Lina's sketch, but infinitely more intricate. They held no meaning he could grasp, only a profound sense of wrongness that curdled his stomach. By morning, they were gone, leaving only smooth, unblemished stone. His supplies dwindled. Hope eroded faster. The entity, the deepward presence, as he begun to think of it, a name too small, too human for the immensity he felt. Wasn't attacking. It was manifesting. Its reality was seeping into his own, warping the physical laws he built his life upon. Water from his canteen tasted faintly of minerals not found on any periodic table. The rock under his hand sometimes yielded slightly, like cold flesh. He found a perfectly smooth, spherical stone nestled in his boot one morning, impossibly warm, etched with those same faint, glowing green lines. He threw it into the darkness. It didn't clatter. It vanished without a sound. The final descent led him into a cavern unlike any other. It wasn't carved by water, but seemed grown, towering pillars, twisted into spirals that defied gravity, stretched towards a ceiling lost in gloom. The floor was unnervingly level, composed of hexagonal basalt tiles that felt disturbingly like bone underfoot. At the cavern's center stood a monolithic structure not built, but extruded from the living rock. It resembled a vast, petrified tree stump. Its surface, a chaotic mosaic of impossible angles, and those maddening, glowing glyphs. The air hummed with power, a physical pressure that made his ears pop and his vision swim. The whispering was deafening now, a chorus of grinding stone, ancient and alien, resonating directly in his mind. Not escape, never escape, assimilation, return. He understood then, with a chilling, absolute certainty, the missing team hadn't been killed. They hadn't fled. They had been absorbed. The deepward presence wasn't an invader. It was the bedrock reality of this place, the sentient consciousness of the mountain itself. Or perhaps something far older that used the mountain as its vessel. It existed on a scale that rendered human life insignificant, a fleeting anomaly, its manifestations wherein attacks, but simply the friction of its immense, timeless existence, brushing against the fragile bubble of Eris's reality. Escape wasn't impossible. It was meaningless, like a single cell trying to flee a body trembling. Eris approached the central monolith. The glyphs flared brighter, bathing him in their sickly green luminescence. The grinding whisper resolved into a single, overwhelming concept: belong. He placed a hand on the monolith's surface. It wasn't cold stone. It was warm, yielding slightly, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat that vibrated up his arm. He felt a terrifying sense of recognition, not from the presence, but from his own body, the minerals in his bones, the water in his cells. They resonated with the ancient song of the mountain. He was part of it, always had been. The separation was the illusion as he stood there. A wave of profound, unnatural calm washed over him. The fear didn't vanish. It was simply absorbed, rendered irrelevant by the crushing weight of eternity. He looked down at his hand, still pressed against the monolith. The skin around his fingertips was turning gray, hardening, taking on the granular texture of weathered granite. Tiny, crystalline structures like minute geodes began to form under his nails. A deep, resonant vibration started within his own chest, harmonizing perfectly with the grinding song of the deepward presence he scream. There was no point. He simply stood, bathed in the alien light, feeling the slow, inevitable transformation begin. The last flicker of Eris Thorn, the geologist, the man, observed with detached horror as the stone claimed him, not as a victim, but as a homecoming. The cavern pulsed, the glyphs flared, and the grinding whisper deepened, satisfied. Another fragment had returned. The mountain breathed, slow and deep, in the endless dark. The light from Eris' headlamp, still strapped to his petrifying helmet, winked out. Only the cold, ancient luminescence of the deepward presence remained, illuminating the silent, growing stone.